Today's episode is a free preview of our sister podcast, To Save Us From Hell. This is the only independent podcast about the United Nations. Co-host Anjali, Dayal, and I are bona fide UN experts. I've covered the UN as a journalist for nearly 20 years. Anjali is a professor of international relations at Fordham University who teaches and researches and studies the UN. And with our powers combined, we bring you insights and analysis about all things United Nations that you simply can't find elsewhere. Full episodes of To Save Us From Hell are available exclusively to paying subscribers. You can get a subscription via globaldispatches.org following the links in the show notes of this episode, or if you're listening directly in Apple Podcasts, you can unlock a subscription in-app. What we're doing with this show is truly unique, and I hope that you will help us keep this show alive and sustain our coverage of the United Nations. Enjoy the episode.
Well, now all that is sadly, parked on one side, and the big exam question is going to be, how cheaply can you do this? Could you run the UN out of a burger van on 44th Street?
Welcome to Save Us From Hell. I am your co-host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I'm the editor of UN Dispatch, and I run Global Dispatches. And as always, To Save Us From Hell is a product of globaldispatches.org.
And I'm Anjali Dayal. I'm an associate professor of international politics at Fordham University in New York, where I teach and do research and write about the United Nations. And we have a very special guest with us today.
A very special guest, the incomparable Richard Gowan. Richard, why don't you introduce yourself?
I'm Richard Gowan. I am the United Nations Director for the International Crisis Group, which is a global conflict prevention organization. And I sit in New York and I spend time talking to diplomats and UN officials about all the bad things going on in the world.
And you talk to Anjali and I with some frequency. I feel like we're getting the band back together, Richard and Anjali.
Yeah, I think it's been about half a year, because we spoke around the time of the last big high-level crazy week at the UN.
It's always a crazy week around the UN. We are going to spend most of our conversation today talking about the race to replace António Guterres as the UN Secretary General. He leaves his office at the end of next year. December 31st, 2026 is his last day in office, but the race to replace him has unofficially kicked off, I'd say, and we're going to discuss that at length in this conversation. But first, I wanted to talk to you both about some kind of late-breaking news from last week that Mike Waltz, the former National Security Advisor to Donald Trump, is no longer the National Security Advisor to Donald Trump, and instead is being tapped to be the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. Now, Anjali and I have talked at length about Elise Stefanik and what she would bring to this role. She, of course, has been withdrawn from the nomination because of the razor-thin majority that Republicans hold in Congress. They can't afford to lose another seat. So Mike Waltz it is. So I have, I think, unconstructed views on Mike Waltz as National Security Advisor. So I'm going to let you two influence me here. Richard, I'll start with you. What's your hot take here?
Well, I mean, obviously, what most people associate Waltz with is Signalgate and the leak of the messages between Waltz and other senior US officials about bombing Yemen. I think overall, what was interesting is that he was seen as a hawk in the administration. And actually, those members of Trump's circle who are more isolationist or quasi-isolationist were worried that Waltz was a bit of a neocon. And there were reports that he had annoyed Trump by suggesting a harder line against Russia. So now he's coming up to New York. I suspect we're going to see him taking a very hard line indeed over certain issues, most obviously issues related to Israel. But people will be wondering if actually he's really speaking for an administration that may be going in a different direction.
Anjali, what's your thinking on Mike Waltz as UN ambassador?
Well, I think first we should understand his appointment as being a result of the political dynamics of the Trump administration in ways that are completely independent from the United Nations. Donald Trump had a political problem. He couldn't fire Mike Waltz. So what did he do? He sent him to the United Nations ambassadorship. Now, that all but guarantees that his confirmation hearings will be a circus because they will be an opportunity for members of Congress, critically, not just Democrats who have been critical of Mike Waltz's role in Signalgate, but also, the bipartisan members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee have expressed a lot of concern about these developments. And so we should expect these hearings to be, I would say, a media circus. And in that sense, we probably will not learn as much about what Mike Waltz plans to do at the United Nations as we would otherwise. So, basically, this is a guarantee that we are going to get a full public hearing on Signalgate. And it's a guarantee, I think, that we are not necessarily going to inspire confidence at the United Nations in Mike Waltz on his arrival. And so, this is a politically precarious position for him to arrive in. He clearly has been shunted off to the side of the Trump administration in a way that sort of is both physical and practical. And he already sat at odds with, as Richard just said, much of the administration in his foreign policy, being a more traditional Republican. Although I will note one who demonstrated that he was willing to moderate his position on Ukraine for the sake of the MAGA caucus. So although he has traditionally been a Russia hawk, he did express concerns about sending more weapons to Ukraine after he joined the Trump cabinet. So in that sense, I think we should see, I would say, the political dynamics of the Trump administration spilling out into what would have been, I think, a stable arena of diplomacy under Elise Stefanik.
Yeah, and that Elise Stefanik point that you and I have made many times, I don't want to rehash it in depth too much, but the point that I think you and I, Anjali, have been making on this show is that she is a Trump loyalist. She was his first cabinet pick after the election. She would have gone to New York with Trump's full confidence and Trump's ear. Mike Waltz arguably is out of favor with Donald Trump for the fact that he was fired from his job as national security advisor. So even if Mike Waltz is confirmed, and I suspect he would be, the key question in my mind is really twofold. Number one, does Mike Waltz have the confidence of Donald Trump? Maybe yes, probably no. Number two, we don't even know yet if this pick is going to be a cabinet level pick. We don't yet know if Mike Waltz will be on the National Security Council, of which he used to lead as National Security Advisor. So these two variables, I think, are key to understanding what Mike Waltz might bring to the job and whether he'd be able to articulate the role that the United Nations could play in advancing certain Trump national security priorities.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing too, which is harkening back to our conversation about Elise Stefanik. This was a major step in her career. She is an ambitious person. Becoming the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations was a coup for her, right? Possibly a stepping stone towards something like Secretary of State, possibly to something bigger. This is a demotion for Mike Waltz, right? And we should understand those two things as placing the United Nations differently in the spectrum of Trump foreign policy as a result. This is a demotion for Mike Waltz. He is unlikely, who knows, I don't know. I'm not sure the next national security advisor is going to want him hanging around the National Security Council, right? So, in that sense, we have seen in the course of trying to correct two domestic political problems, a full-scale demotion and how important the United Nations is going to be towards the inner cabinet.
Well, I mean, a couple of points there, though. Firstly, I'm not sure that Stefanik was necessarily completely paged into what the Trump administration was planning for the UN. If you go back to her confirmation hearing, you'll find that she was talking about the importance of supporting the World Food Programme.
Right.
And lo and behold, the Trump administration has now imposed cuts on WFP that mean it's have to cut 25% of its staff. Stefanik, quite like Rubio, actually, presented a more traditional republicanism in her confirmation hearing than the administration has pursued at the UN. So she would also have been having to play catch up, I think, with the White House. And then as far as Waltz is concerned, I mean, I absolutely hear you. I mean, it is a little weird to see Manhattan being treated as sort of the Siberia of American politics. But if you talk to UN officials, if you talk to diplomats from other countries, they are actually a bit more optimistic because they're saying, at least we have an ambassador. We've gone for over 100 days without any grown-up representative of Trumpland in New York. And even if this guy is damaged goods, he does at least know how the president thinks. And, you know, he will be a political player in the UN space, even if he's been a bit beaten up on the way here. So actually, ironically, when I heard the news, I was with a group of UN Secretariat staff, and they were happy because, I mean, they would accept really anyone from Washington now who would give them any insight into how Trump sees the UN in the world.
That is, I think, so optimistic about the way the dynamics of the Trump administration work, first of all. I mean, not to undersell what I think is understandable optimism, I would first say I would never undersell Elise Stefanik's political acumen. There's a citation in the New York Times story about her the other day, which essentially said at this point she walks on water for Trump. I think in the service of her own ambition, she might have pulled off things that others could not have because she's better at politics than Marco Rubio. She simply is. She's better at politics than Mike Waltz. So I don't know what her ambassadorship would have looked like. I do know that Mike Waltz has already demonstrated that he does not have the favor of the president, and he does not have the favor of the president's closest advisors. That might mean nothing on the balance. It might mean exactly the kind of optimism that you've hoped for, that someone is in charge. Or it might mean that the baseline work that the mission to the UN has been doing is actually disrupted by having someone who is a key political actor who doesn't know much about this on arrival.
But I think some of the product is going to be the same. I mean, we all assumed that Stefanik was going to be quite strongly focused on Israel and also Iran. And Waltz, I mean, he has similar instincts. And there is one interesting wrinkle here, which is that there was reporting that he could have taken another job as his exit option. He was offered Riyadh, to be the US ambassador in Riyadh. And
interesting.
Talking about Siberia.
Well, no, because in Riyadh, you know, there's always the hope that Trump will broker Israeli normalization. But I think he probably chose the UN because the UN, as Stefanik recognized, but also as previous folk like Nikki Haley has recognized, is a place where you can sort of score political points. You get attention for what you say.
Yeah.
And so Waltz may actually be viewing the UN as a place where, in particular, by speaking out on behalf of Israel, he can start rebuilding his brand after a tricky period.
It's interesting. The last person I could think of to rotate between the U.S. ambassador to the UN position and national security advisor is, of course, Susan Rice in the Obama administration, who went the other direction from the UN ambassador to the national security advisor. You know, she was supposed to be tapped for Secretary of State, but because of Benghazi Gate, you know, that kind of fakeish scandal, she was not considered Senate confirmable. So she became national security advisor instead. So at this point, we'll see what happens. You know, there has been no nomination hearing scheduled, as far as I can tell, for Mike Waltz. It likely will be the circus that Anjali describes, focusing more arguably on Waltz's actions as national security advisor and less on his views about the United Nations. So I don't think we'll glean too much from that. But I know, Anjali, you and I will be watching. Maybe we'll do another live stream after the hearing ends, whenever it's scheduled. I look forward to that.
Let's see if they schedule the hearing. I don't know.
Yeah, we'll see.
We could just live in this world where every 100 days they toss out another guy's name.
There you go. There you go. So speaking of transitions at the United Nations. Let's talk about the race to replace Secretary General António Guterres. Again, as I mentioned earlier, his term ends at the end of 2026. And we've begun this kind of informal process to select his replacement. So, Anjali, I know you have been doing a big project on the whole process of selecting the next Secretary General. So, can you just walk listeners through what this entails?
The most notable thing is that the Secretary General is elected by the UN General Assembly on recommendation from the UN Security Council. That means any potential Secretary General has to clear the Security Council with 9 votes, including all 5 of the permanent members. So it has to curry the favor of all 5 of the permanent members. Cannot be someone whose positions are objectionable to any of those 5 permanent members, but must also be acceptable to a majority of the UN's membership. So in that sense, it's a 2-stage process. The Secretary General candidate must first survive the vetting of the Security Council and must survive a vote of the General Assembly. And this makes for a sort of balancing act between fidelity to the institution and the preferences of the permanent 5 members. That is a uniquely difficult balancing act at this moment, right? But it is one that tends to produce a consensus candidate over the course of sort of the UN's political life. And as you noted, right, that process is sort of getting off in earnest informally right now. And then we'll probably conclude in the fall of next year with a definitive pick. At least that would sort of reflect what's happened in the past.
And Richard, what does it mean that this process has informally kicked off?
Well, I think actually there's been a shadow campaign going back at least a couple of years, because according to a UN convention, the job should rotate between different regions, and that means that this time around it happens to be Latin America's turn, or Latin America and the Caribbean. And we've definitely spotted certain politicians from that region taking soundings more or less explicitly, at least in the last 2.5 years. For quite a while, there was a presumptive frontrunner who was Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, who is a bit of a star at the UN General Assembly. She gives very powerful speeches about things like climate change. A lot of people thought that she was a very strong candidate even 2 years ago. But it is also usual that at about this time, with 18 months or so to go before the actual selection, a lot more candidates start coming forward. And that's what we are beginning to see. I think it's also worth saying that everyone was hanging back a little bit to see the result of the US election. And to be quite honest, I think Mia Mottley's chances are significantly reduced now that you have Trump in the White House. I mean, she has some pretty socialist messaging that will not play. So other candidates are starting to jump in. All of them names we'd heard already, but people are going public. So Rafael Grossi, the head of the IAEA, the Atomic Energy Agency, he's from Argentina. He was in New York just in the last weeks for a meeting on the non-proliferation treaty. Diplomats say that he's pretty openly campaigning now. Michelle Bachelet, the former president of Chile, who's been talked about as an SG for at least 15 years, was at a meeting with Hillary Clinton at Columbia University, and she said outright she was interested in the job. People are starting to move now that they understand roughly what the framework is going to be with this US administration.
What about Rebecca Greenspan?
So Rebecca Greenspan is, for those who don't know all their UN senior staff, she's a senior trade official based in Geneva. Her name has been in discussion quite a lot. I think it's a fairly open secret that she's interested in the job.
Costa Rican, right?
Yeah, and I think she may have been asked about it in public, but she's definitely one of a handful of names that sort of everyone refers to when you ask who's in the race, but not as yet sort of getting as out there as, for example, Grossi seems to be.
So, Richard, all of the names that you've listed thus far are from Latin America and the Caribbean. The norm is that it would be their turn, this region's turn, to produce a Secretary General. However, there is one name outside the region, the current Deputy Secretary General, Amina Mohammed, that I've seen floated around. Is she sort of dipping her toe in the ring a little bit?
Yeah, it's been an open secret that she is quite interested in the top job. It's hard to say what her chances are right at the moment. I mean, actually, she may be at a disadvantage because she was so closely associated with Guterres for the last 8 years. Frankly, there are a lot of people in Washington in particular who remain very angry with Guterres over what he has said about Gaza. And the fact that she was on his team would probably be detrimental in their point of view. And, also to be quite honest, if you talk to a lot of member states at the moment, there's quite a lot of frustration with the Guterres era around the UN. There is a feeling that the UN has lost salience, especially on peace and security issues. And I think that there is probably a desire for a fresh start, despite Amina Mohammed's obvious qualifications after nearly 10 years as deputy head.
So, Anjali, all of the names that Richard just raised, save one, Rafael Grossi, are women. Last time around, there was this big push that the person who ought to replace Ban Ki-moon should be a woman because there has never been a female Secretary General. How salient is that today in what will be 2026 when this decision is made?
Yeah, well, it's been a centerpiece of a bunch of different, for example, civil society campaigns around the next Secretary General. It was also, as you noted, a big centerpiece of the last campaign for UN Secretary General. At the end of the day, political calculations pushed António Guterres to the forefront, right? So it's not a done deal. It is, as you mentioned, this is the UN's 80th year. There has never been a woman at the helm of the United Nations. It, as Richard mentioned, is a particularly challenging moment, I think, for the nomination of a woman to this position because of the Trump administration's political platform. That is not to say that every woman is progressive and therefore at odds with the Trump administration. It's just to say the Trump administration's selection process privileges someone who is not a woman. But we should also note, right, that this Secretary General would be taking the helm of the United Nations at a time of unique crisis and real difficulty for the United Nations. Between funding crises, between fundamental contraventions of the Charter by permanent members on multiple sides, between the sort of sheer inability of the UN to broker political solutions to conflicts over the course of the Guterres era at the United Nations. And so there's some sense in which the campaign to have a woman lead the UN now has the attributes of something like a glass cliff, right? Where you give the position to a woman at a moment when the organization is most vulnerable. And then when there's disaster, you're able to say, well, we tried something, it didn't work, right? That's a sort of not uncommon trajectory for organizations that are in crisis to choose the kind of leader that they've never had before. That isn't to say that would be the only reason to select a woman. It's just to say it's now an additional consideration. The UN is in a very different position now than it was at the time that António Guterres was selected. And even that process produced a more traditional candidate than what we're seeing right now.
I mean, I think that's really crucial about the race. I think the US cuts and the sort of the devastating effect on the UN are just simply changing the terms of the selection process. If you go back 2 years when Mia Mottley was the presumptive frontrunner, everyone thought the big question for the next Secretary General would be, how do we accelerate implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals? How do we sort of get a better deal for the Global South on debt and economic growth? Well, now all that is sadly, parked on one side, and the big exam question is going to be, how cheaply can you do this? Could you run the UN out of a burger van on 44th Street? You might just be able to afford that.
Bowling alley in Secaucus.
Yeah.
People are going to be your ambitions are high. People are going to be sort of coming forward now, and they do put out little manifestos, although we wouldn't expect to see those until the end of this year or early next year. What pretty much every candidate is going to be focusing on is, how do I shrink stuff? How do I rationalize things? How do I streamline things? Because that is what the political market now really wants.
To what extent will kind of shifting geopolitical dynamics shape this race, this debate? As Anjali noted at top, this is at first a selection of the Security Council. And in the past, you've had like rounds of voting at the Security Council. And these rounds of voting proceed until a candidate is, selected, basically approved by the permanent members. And, typically at the Security Council, you will have the Western three countries on one side and Russia and China on the other. But with a Trump administration, the U.S. is something of a wild card here. Might we have a voting outcome and a voting process in which you have the U.S., China, and Russia agreeing on a particular candidate and the other two permanent members, France and the UK, not agreeing? It would be kind of a wild scenario, but it doesn't seem out the realm of possibility at this point.
Actually, there have been occasions in relatively recent history where even the P3, the big Western powers, haven't agreed. So in, I guess, 2006, the US insisted on forcing out Boutros Boutros-Ghali, the first post-Cold War Secretary General, who had fallen under the Clinton administration. But the French fought very, very long and hard to keep Boutros-Ghali in place. And actually, they only stood down and allowed Kofi Annan to have the job when Kofi promised them that France would be allowed to be in charge of the UN peacekeeping department. Mm-hmm. So there are frictions. And if you look at someone like Grossi, he's from Argentina. My people back in London have always been wary of having an Argentinian Secretary General because they think that they might weigh in on the Falklands-Malvinas issue. Issues like that can split the group.
Let me ask you one more question on this Argentina issue, because at the United Nations these days, you're seeing a not insignificant number of 192 to 2 votes. And the other two are the United States and Argentina under Milei. I don't know what kind of relationship Milei and Grossi have, but it's like an interesting wrinkle to consider, I suppose.
Yeah, and I've heard contradictory accounts of how close they are, but it is also a little difficult for Grossi if he does get Argentina support. You're right; the current Argentinian government is probably the most fiercely anti-UN government there is. I mean, the president has referred to the place as sort of a socialist den of horribleness or something, which is is an interesting platform to campaign on. Just coming back to your broader question, despite the fact we can see differences in the past, I would agree. This is an occasion where you could imagine some weird Moscow, Washington, Beijing stitch up for a candidate that a lot of other council members would have doubts about. I mean, it is very, very fluid indeed. One former candidate from a decade ago who's back on the scene is Vuk Jeremic, a former foreign minister from Serbia, who's again seems to be out testing the waters. But one of Vuk's claims is that he has the trust of the Russians, and maybe he sees himself as a bridge between the US and Russia. So it is affecting calculations.
What do you think, Anjali, on this question of the broader changing geopolitics at the UN and how that might impact the selection process?
Yeah, we've talked a little in the past about the sort of swing of the US from the sort of P3 to the sort of authoritarian bloc. But I think it's worth noting the cross purposes at which the American Russian and Chinese governments all find themselves at, right? It's not, I think, immediately clear that the Chinese and American positions on who should be the Secretary General will be similar. And in that sense, I think we might sort of find ourselves in a space where the UK and France can perhaps agree on someone, and perhaps the US and Russia can perhaps agree on someone. And China is doing its own thing depending on who the candidate is. If we think about the extremely antagonistic relationship that
That was a free preview of our full episode. To unlock the episode, please go to globaldispatches.org and purchase a subscription. We rely on your support to keep this show going. Thank you. Thank you for listening to Save Us From Hell. The show is co-hosted by me, Mark Leon Goldberg, and Anjali Dayal. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. Our cover art is by Sarah D. Michelle. If you've not already done so, please subscribe to our show via Substack at globaldispatches.org. We are sustaining this show by selling subscriptions to it via Substack. You can get a discounted subscription by going to globaldispatches.org/save us. You can follow the link in the show notes as well. And finally, if you'd like to discuss this episode with us, please visit globaldispatches.org and click on chat, where we'll be around to discuss what we discussed in this episode. Thanks, and be sure to tell friends and colleagues about To Save Us From Hell, a new podcast about the United Nations.